I'll introduce myself. My name is JP Ouellette, and a quick, quickish background on me is that I spent 20 years in the medical field, and 5 of those years was in the Air Force as a medic, and that's where I kind of started getting my experience in crisis intervention and crisis management with people in need. Um, Went to work for a medical clinic and went and got a degree in human services where I studied more crisis intervention, social work, um, conflict management, conflict resolution, and stayed at the clinic for a while and then joined a nonprofit where we built our own mediation center, community mediation center, and started working with families in crisis that were falling apart. Um, During that time, I, I joined a board with Alaska Youth and Family Network and chaired that board and was the vice chair for the Mediators Association and was the chair for the Alaska Citizens Review Panel. And that's how I got introduced into the work of child welfare and child protection. And I only say all this to say that what we're talking about tonight is super important to me. When we talk about being trauma informed and trauma informed care and trauma informed teaching, trauma informed parenting, those are things that are really dear to my heart. And I've just gone from one thing to the next, trying to find that next level of how do we understand this better. So with that said, I will go ahead and launch this PowerPoint here. Does anybody have any questions right off the bat? Okay. Thank you all for being here, by the way. I know you could be eating dinner right now. Well, some of you are eating dinner right now. Okay, there we are. This is my business, Peacemaking Partners. It's been around for a few years. After the venture with the nonprofit Community Mediation Center, we started our own businesses, and the partner I was with at the time, he started one working with companies, and I started one working more with families and organizations in town, helping them resolve conflict peacefully and understand the dynamics of conflict and trauma and why life gets so yucky and why that can be pretty awesome if we learn how to leverage it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And in terms of this ACEs, this concept of ACEs, adverse childhood events. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. Okay, adverse childhood events. The point of this whole meeting tonight, this presentation, is to understand better how we can help kids grow and not shrink in adversity. And one thing you'll notice is that I didn't say what we're going to learn tonight is how to prevent adverse childhood events. And we're going to talk more about later about why I'm not going to talk about how to prevent them. We're going to talk about how to leverage them. And at any time, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat. Or you can unmute and just interrupt me. I'm okay with that too. We were just talking, Katrina and I earlier. I have 8 children at home. I'm used to being interrupted. So the main things we're going to cover tonight about adverse childhood events. Why does this matter? Why do ACEs matter in our lives? What are ACEs anyhow? Some of you may be familiar with the ACEs study, and some of you may be less familiar. You'll all be a little more familiar by the time we're done. Now, how do we promote growth through adversity? most of us would prefer to just grow without adversity. I mean, I would. Maybe you guys are different, but um, I've learned through the hard way that that's not going to happen. I'm not going to grow without being challenged. And once we learn to look at challenges a little differently, which is where we're going to land tonight, we're going to see how much life really is pretty awesome, how much even the hard things have something amazing to offer, and how we can teach our kids to do just that and get upstream of this thing that we're calling ACEs. So why does this matter? The reason that it's important to understand ACEs is because we develop a foundational sense of who we are during childhood. And in a couple slides later, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on that. The second reason why this matters is because adversity is not only unpredictable, but it's inevitable. We're not going to escape adversity. And the more we try to shelter our children from adversity, now, a lot of the things we're going to talk about, we do want to prevent. We don't want to expose our children to. But adversity in general is something that our children need to learn to walk through and to grow from. And it's inevitable. We will experience adversity. Everybody right now already knows that's true. So this is not a tough time to preach that adversity is inevitable. We've all been in lockdown for a long time. And the third reason that this matters so much is that when we're in adversity, we can go two different ways. And we always go two different ways. We either shrink or we grow. And what I want to do tonight is share with you how we can actually grow through adversity all the time and teach our kids to do that as well. So remember, the first point I said was that we develop our sense of self in our childhood. And what we're talking about tonight is really our kids, whether you're a teacher or whether you're a parent or a grandparent. We have children in our lives, and we have children in our lives for a short time. And it's a short and it's a crucial time. So as you can see here, I don't know if how many are familiar with Erik Erikson, but he was a psychologist that developed this stages of psychosocial development. And so during the time that our kids are home with us, they learn trust versus mistrust. They learn autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative and guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion. And right before they leave the house, they start experimenting with intimacy versus isolation. And those are the real fun years. So if you look at these things, it's one thing to say, yeah, they have to learn all these things. And it's important that we teach them these things. It's really important to understand that the foundation of how they relate to these things is built during these years. There's always second chances, but with these developmental aspects of our children's lives, we don't want to have to rely on a second chance to teach these things. They become foundational to how they relate to life and relationships from this point forward. So this is why I'm so passionate about sharing this with parents and educators, what we're going to talk about, because we really do have an opportunity to forge a generation of resilient kids. And that is what keeps me going every day, is the notion that we can do just that and the impact it'll have on our communities. So briefly, before we get into the ACEs study, I want to talk about a little bit of psychology, psychology and physiology. The corpus callosum, I don't know if you guys can see my pointer, but if you can see the corpus callosum there, this is what helps your left brain and your right brain talk to each other. And when we are in a period of stress, or when we're experiencing something that's difficult to wade through. We everybody knows that feeling when you um, maybe you're out and you hear something rustling in the bushes, or you're at home alone and you hear something in the garage, or you are fighting with somebody at work and you see them coming down the hallway. All of those can evoke the same response, and we really need a strong corpus callosum to help us use both parts of our brain to both process our emotions and make sense of things in a way that's going to be productive. Why that matters tonight is that adversity in young children, um, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second, but adversity in young children can stunt the growth of this corpus callosum and start to make it physiologically difficult for them to process relational difficulties. So it's really important that we understand how crucial and how just the level of impact that this can have on kids. So we're talking about the brain and how the brain responds to adversity and how adversity affects the brain and makes changes in the brain. And that leads to this fun little slide here. I talked earlier about how I was working with different people throughout the different ventures that I'd taken on, and my most recent one was mediation, and this happens all the time in mediation. So I'm just gonna go through this really quick and see if anybody can resonate with these steps. So you get sensory data fed to the thalamus, and what that is, if you can stop and think of the last nerve-wracking conflict that you had with somebody, or even the earthquake the other day. Some people may have responded this way when we had the earthquake the other day, or anything that kind of rocks you in the moment. Um, Even a fight you may have had with your spouse, say. Those are all kind of lumped into this same concept of when the amygdala kicks in and starts to take over the brain. So you get the sensory data, and the data just bypasses most of the brain and goes to the amygdala for a quick threat assessment. Then it goes to the cortex. And then there's that threat assessment, number 4, that I was talking about. And it blocks slow thinking. And slow thinking is what children learn as their brain is developing. Like I was saying with the corpus callosum, to use the left and the right parts of the brain to really process and build context around what's going on. So when kids are experiencing an adverse event, they don't naturally stop and think about it. In fact, Jen just posed this question to me yesterday morning, which I thought was a brilliant question given what we're talking about tonight. If children they're so in the moment, and they're mostly, especially young children, they're about what I want now, right? Everybody can relate to that. Our kids they're not thinking about the future. They're not holding off on that marshmallow to get the second marshmallow later. They're not really thinking about the past, although some of their past experiences are feeding into how they think about things. They're thinking about right now. So how in the world can they build context around what's happening when they encounter something difficult and something that maybe they shouldn't encounter or aren't ready to encounter, or the adults around them aren't prepared to help them with? That's when the amygdala hijack steps in, and you get an unthinking response. And we get enough of those, and our brain starts to do unthinking responses much quicker each time. So the more we veer away from being able to think through these things, the more our brain starts making snap judgments about life in general. Anything that comes up as difficult or intrusive starts to elicit this amygdala hijack. And so we get an unthinking response, and after working with hundreds of people in crisis and in conflict, we have a community that is rampant with unthinking responses. And, and including myself, I can relate to that, and we all can relate to this at some level. We can remember a time when we were jacked by somebody or something, and we had an unthinking response. So hold on to those thoughts. We're going to come back to them later, and now I want to talk about the ACEs study. Um, the ACEs study, it started with a doctor, Vincent, I think it's pronounced Felitti. He had a large group of, no pun intended, obesity patients that he was working with, um, that in spite of the fact that they were losing weight, they were doing well, they were dropping out of the program. They would lose 100 pounds or so, and then they would drop out. And when they dropped out, they'd go back to gaining weight again. And he was puzzled by that. So we started looking into, why are my patients dropping out? They're doing well. What's going on here? And he realized that after talking with them, that they all had stuff going on in the background that made them believe that they could not succeed. They had a set point in their mind, even though they were experiencing success. They had lost 100 pounds or more in his program. They had a set point in their mind that said, I'm much more comfortable with failure. I'm much more comfortable with remaining obese and remaining, I'm more comfortable with this situation that keeps me isolated from the rest of the world. So he was really intrigued by that, and he started to ask more questions. And what that turned into later, what they found with this a group of about 700 people or so, they found that the things that they experienced as children started to correlate with the health risks that they had as adults. And we're going to be more specific about that in a minute. So just to make sure that this wasn't a fluke or that his study was legit, they expanded it to the entire Kaiser Permanente hospital area in San Diego, which included over 9,500 patients that they interviewed. And they went over their trauma history, and they compared that trauma history to the scores from their physical exams. And they did it again with the same number of patients in 1997 and got the same results. And this was the results. Um, they broke down adverse childhood experiences into abuse and home dysfunction. And you can read those here. I won't depress everybody by reading all of this stuff. But as a quick preview, on the left side there, those are what they were asking people if they had experienced in there. Those are the categories of things that they were curious, did you experience these things as a child? And on the right side, they were seeing if they correlated with these health risk factors, because in the smaller study, they did in fact correlate, and in larger study, they did as well. Any questions yet? I know I can be a fire hose sometimes. I'm also a preacher's kid, so I can talk for hours without caring if anybody's listening. Okay, moving on. The outcomes that they got were that 67% of the population had at least one ACE. So they had experienced at least one of these things that most of us would say we hope we never experience in our lifetime. Some form of abuse or some dysfunction in the home. 67% of the population. 20% had 3 or more of those ACEs. So a fifth of the population had 3 or more of those either abusive or home dysfunction experiences in their childhood. And then 13% had 4 or more. And the reason that's in red is because when they encountered children or people who'd had 4 or more ACEs in their childhood, something switched in their lives, something switched in their brains, and 4 seemed to be the magic number where the results of their lives were much more dramatic than they were at 3 or 2 or 1. This is going to get happy, I promise. So the connection that they made was that the kids with 4 or more ACEs, which was 13% of the population, When compared to the kids who had no ACEs, which was about a third of the population, were 4 to 12 times more likely to develop that entire column of risk factors that we've looked at. So the obesity, the suicidal tendencies, the drugs, um, sexual promiscuity, all of these things that were the major indicators of someone who would likely die before their time and have a pretty difficult adulthood. Four more ACEs, they were 4 to 12 times. 12 times is a lot. More likely to experience health risk factors. So now, most of us aren't experiencing the types of things that they asked about. Some of us may have experienced one or two of those. In fact, it says most of us probably have experienced one, 67% of us. A very small percent of us have experienced four or more. And our children that we're talking about here within the family partnership, within Anchorage, within the families that are interested in this topic, a lot of them, most of them, at least 67% of them statistically aren't experiencing those ACEs on a regular basis. They may experience one throughout their childhood. So how does this relate? And this is where I'd like to open it up. You can type it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. What are some of the things that our kids are facing today that you guys think could provoke that amygdala hijack, or that they could use some help walking through? And I'll give some examples, but yeah, go ahead, Katrina. What are your thoughts?
Well, the pandemic, the isolation.
That's a big one. That's a big one. So how about the Black Lives Matter movement? How about the left versus the right? The fact that our White House was our White House was attacked by Americans. Um, I know kids that I'm aware of that are privy to that information and pay attention to that. It was nerve-wracking for them. Um, Kids that have experienced divorce, kids that are experiencing cyberbullying. Um, and then, like you said, then there's this pandemic that kind of takes everything and cranks it up a few notches. Kids in isolation right now are, for lack of a better word, they can be floundering, and us as parents too. We were floundering, and I'd like to say that we're actually doing much better now because we started to figure things out. It's been about a year, but the reality is that it took about a year to get our feet back underneath us and trying to figure out how do we create this sense of quality of life around this pandemic for ourselves, let alone try to understand what our kids are going through when they're experiencing this. I know for me, sometimes it felt like every man for himself. when, when I would like to think I was really always conscious about how is this affecting my children, it was more of, what do you mean you're sending my kids home? I have to work. Take them back. I can't do this. But those of you that are homeschooling, you are already ahead of the game. So good on you. So the reality is that our kids are facing plenty of things today, and they could use help walking through these things. We could all use help walking through these things. So there's a big however in the ACEs study. And I love howevers because, like I said before, the data there was a little gloom and doom. In fact, one of the psychologists was quoted as saying, "When I realized what we'd been missing for decades, I wept." And he repeated it, "I wept." Because it was devastating for him to see that psychologists and doctors and professionals have been working with these people and had no idea what was going on underneath that was motivating these poor health factors. And I'm sorry for the background noise. I think my cat might be having a seizure or it's a hairball. So the big however here is that there was another connection made. For kids who had four more aces, some of them still thrive. And how on earth do they do that? And love is the answer. To quote John Lennon and get all hippy dippy on everybody, love was the answer. So there was a whole subset of kids that had four more aces, and the expectation was that they were going to develop these terrible life outcomes and experience all these health risk factors. And some of these surveys came back and they said, wait a minute, you're healthy. How did that happen? And what they said was, well, I had strong, supportive adults in my life. I experienced terrible things. And I'm speaking on behalf of these kids. They experienced terrible things, but somebody was there to walk them through it and to teach them how to relate to those things as something that was external to them, not something that identified who they were. And at those young stages of their lives, it was crucial that somebody make that difference for them so that their brain could have gone one or two directions. So before I said we want to help kids grow, not shrink during adversity. And what these people did was they helped them grow through adversity, which we call post-traumatic growth, right? I don't know if you guys have heard that term. I'm sure you have. So love, what has love got to do with it? Um, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you guys, most of you, I'm sure, have seen this before. And at the bottom, we have physiological needs. That's our food, our water. Then we have safety. Most of our kids have homes. The fact that you guys are joining me via Zoom tells me that most of the children in your life have their physiological needs met and they're safe. Now, the next level is love and belonging. That's where that's where things get real for most of us, and that's where most of our adversity and our conflict exists, is in that sense of love and belonging. And what Maslow proposed is that you have to have love and belonging to go to the next level, which is esteem and feeling like you have value and worth and can contribute to the world around you. And if you didn't have that, then you would never find self-actualization. And self-actualization for a long time was thought by psychologists to be something that nobody actually ever achieves. It's just something we're going for. But I think that we're seeing now that people are achieving it because they're starting to figure life out. Yay, humanity. We're starting to figure life out. And this is a big part of it. And sometimes I like to think that we could turn that hierarchy of needs upside down and help kids understand who they are. Um, and then it branches out into all the other things that they can achieve for their lives. But this idea that love is the answer, love conquers fear, is really science. I was trekking on this for a while, and then all of a sudden it popped up in Psychology Today. Love versus fear, and then I started to see article after article after article. This was about 5 years ago. Love versus fear. Psychology was breaking everything down to love versus fear, which was really cool to see because it tells me that people are getting it, and not it's people of the scientific community. So I encourage you to look it up. Psychology Today, Love and Fear. So we teach our kids to do one or two things. One of two things when they're experiencing adversity in this realm, fear or love. We teach them judgment, or we teach them curiosity. We teach them confusion, or we teach them confidence. And a lot of people ask, well, what do you mean we're teaching them things? I don't teach them to fear anything. I don't teach them to be judgmental. I don't teach them to be confused. I do my very best to avoid all of those things. But are we proactive in teaching them love? Are we proactive in teaching them curiosity? And are we doing things that build their confidence? Do we have enough emotional and mental energy left at the end of the day to think about how do I build confidence in my child? And these things are all really important, and we're going to go bring them together here shortly. So you look back at this hierarchy of needs, and you see after our physiological needs and our basic safety, you have love and belonging. Well, in that, um, we're teaching our kids fear or love. And if we start to teach them love, then they can start to look at the world with eyes of curiosity versus judgment. And what I mean by that is they're looking at situations, not already judging them as detrimental. So if they can encounter something that's difficult and look at it with curiosity and say, huh, I wonder, I wonder why this is happening, or I wonder what I can do about this. And kids young enough, they're not going to go through that process. Um, but as they grow, we want to teach them not to judge so quickly that things are bad. And when they learn to do that, then they really build their confidence in their ability to overcome, and not only overcome, to be innovative. So this goes back to that amygdala hijack. And if we're not paying attention, or if we don't know any better, how easy it is to let that part of our brain, they call it the lizard brain, to let that part of our brain take over. And there's lots of reasons why that part of our brain takes over. Some of it is because we start the day with caffeine and sugar before we have any protein. Some of it is because many of us have poor sleep hygiene, and we're running on low sleep, or we're staying up late at night and we're looking at a screen, and so our brains aren't really shutting off and having time to rest before we go to bed. And I could go on and on and on and make most of us feel terrible about the things we do every day. But the truth is, there are lots of things we can do to start to train our brain to think differently about conflict and think differently about adversity. And the reason why it's so important that we understand this, and and the reason why it's so important that we start to look within ourselves to say, am I being curious, or am I being judgmental? Am I responding in fear, or am I responding in love when I'm encountering adverse experiences with people? Um, do I walk through the situation with confidence, or am I just utterly confused and floundering? Because this is how they're learning it. So the way we talk about the pandemic, the way we talk about our day at work, the way we, even at the dinner table, the way we talk about any of the things that are troubling us, are we teaching them curiosity, or are we teaching them judgment? Are we teaching them fear, or are we teaching them love? Are we building confidence, or are we confusing them about whether they actually really want to grow up in this world or not? Because some kids, if you ask some kids, they'll tell you they don't ever want to grow up because they watch their parents, and growing up must be terrible and not any fun at all. So it's really important to understand these processes that are going through our brain. And I want to open it up. I know there's only four of us on the line, so um, you may or may not feel comfortable participating or shouting things out, and that's okay. But I'd like to hear people's thoughts on whether it's at the dinner table, or whether it's with your children in any environment, or your family. What are some ways that we can communicate about life, about the pandemic, about social events that are going on, um, about our frustration with homeschooling, about our frustration with the school district going this way and then that way and then this way and then that way. I could bring up all kinds of things, but what are some examples that you guys think how we can do this differently, how we could speak in love versus fear? It's a tough question. Most of you are still waiting for dinner, so it wasn't very fair to throw this at you.
Well, I don't know everything and I'm still learning, but one of the things that has helped my family is instead of speaking about those things with uncertainty, because there is a lot of uncertainty around all those things that you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
but instead saying something like, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I know that when I face hard things, I have the ability to grow. And so instead of speaking of the uncertainty of the event, speaking of what I know for sure, which is that all of us can grow from that. Or to say something like, I don't know what will happen a year from now, but I know that I'm always going to love you. And I know that I'm always going to,
Yeah,
be here for you. And so to always counterbalance the hard with something that I know for certain.
that's beautiful. That's awesome because, and what you said in that was giving them something consistent, and the fact that these things are really hard, and I will always love you. You will always have that. That's something that they can hold on to, and kids really need consistency, and they need to know something of value is going to be there all the time. Any other thoughts? I would say one time my daughter blew me away. I think she was 7, and I was saying, I don't know how we're going to get through this, but we're going to get through it. We always do. And I don't even remember what I was talking about, but I evidently was communicating to her I wasn't doing so well. and and the little 7-year-old looked at me and she goes, well, Dad, God will take care of us. He made us, so it's kind of his responsibility. And it was so profound to me. And whatever you believe about that, um, people have lots of different beliefs about God, and who's there, who isn't there, and what he does or he doesn't do. Um, but if you need something to cling to, clinging to the notion that you will be taken care of. You always have been taken care of, one way or another. We are sitting here, all the things that we've been through, we can look back and say, at some extent, we have been loved all of our life. And I share that with my kids now, that no matter what happens, you will always be loved and you will always be cared for. And so long as they cling to that, it will be true. I do believe that. So the next thing is the judgment versus curiosity. And I would throw out there again, how do we, so we could take it specifically. I was having this conversation with the kids probably, I don't know, about a week ago, and they were talking about Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So it's probably more than a week ago because nobody's really talking about that anymore. But maybe it was a couple months ago. Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And the way we talk about things could really make them feel insecure about our country and the future of our country. It could also make them feel very judgmental about people who don't agree with us politically. Um, how do we teach them in these moments to be curious rather than judgmental when we're talking about politics, even when we talk about the people who stormed the White House?
Well, one thing my husband likes to do is play devil's advocate. So just put yourself in the shoes of someone who doesn't have the same opinion as you and see how they're approaching the situation. And we actually talked to our two boys, almost 8 and 10, about Biden and Trump. And we have, of course,
Mhm.
different opposing views. in our family. We're grandparents and everything. So we taught them, or we talked to them about it, and we told them about how we see it and how other people see it in our family, and just to give them the option to see it a different way and to not get mad if they do see it another way, and just have them think about it.
Oh, that's good.
I love that. I love that because at a crucial point in their brain development, what you just did was allow, I'm going to get nerdy on you, but what you just did was you allowed neurons to spread out in different ways to use more of their brain, to learn to use more of their brain. And this will apply to more than just Biden and Trump. This will apply to how they look at life in general. But you just gave their brain an opportunity to grow to a place where they can actually think beyond one way of seeing things. And when they can do that, this going back to adverse childhood events, when they come up, the more they learn to do that, the more they're taught to do that, and the more we model for them how to do that, when they experience an adverse event, they're not going to immediately say, this is someone's fault, this is someone's fault, someone else's fault, or this is going to hurt me, or this will never work, or this is terrible, or I'll never get a job now, or I'll never survive this, or I'll never heal from that. We can teach them to say, wow, I wonder what this is about, and I wonder what the possibilities are. I wonder what life will look like now that X, Y, and Z. Or I wonder why somebody did that. In my role, now I'm working with Child Protective Services a lot. In my role, it's really important when I go to parents and I say, I wonder what happened there. I wonder where that comes from. And sometimes that curiosity makes the difference between whether those parents ever see their kids again. Not that I don't know what happened. Sorry about that. Blame it on COVID. Darn COVID messed up my screen. What I was saying is that they'll learn to look at adversity with curiosity. And the children that were taught to do that throughout their lives, whether they had one ace or whether they had four more aces, they learned to look at life with curiosity. And it turns out they were wondering, I wonder how I'm going to get through this. I know I am. I just wonder how. So let me share my screen again. Not that you're missing a whole lot, but okay. So judgment versus curiosity. I wonder. I love those words. I wonder. And then confusion versus confidence. That is something that was probably the most challenging in the beginning of this pandemic. Is teaching our kids confidence over confusion, because most of us had no idea what the heck was going on, if we were gonna make it, if the world was coming to an end. Or I remember when I first watched it happening in China, I said, well, America's been preparing for things like this for decades. We're never going to have that problem here. And there's all kinds of ideas that we could go down a rabbit hole there. But the reality is, it was really hard to walk through life with confidence when things are changing every single day. And what's on the media is saying, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. Or don't do this and don't do that. And then you got other people saying, be afraid to listen to those people who are telling you to be afraid. So you got two extremes pulling you two different directions, and where we were was really confused. I say a collective we, maybe some people weren't, but I was pretty confused. I tried my best to find a stance and to find a middle ground and try to stay there lovingly and with curiosity and with confidence, but it was shaky. And my kids were observing that, and my kids were experiencing that, and it took a very conscious effort to do the things you guys have talked about, to carry myself in a way that taught them to not fall into confusion, to find something, some way to build their confidence. And I'm curious if you guys have ideas in the midst of what can be very confusing, how we might build confidence in our children. That's a tough one.
I don't know how to do this well. This is something I've been working on with my own kids. But I think that one of the things is just teaching that idea that failure is okay. That's how we grow and that's how we learn. And that it's not something we want to avoid, but it's okay to make mistakes because that's how our brain grows.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent way to build confidence, is to remove the shame of making mistakes. One thing that that we did was, we still made the kids go outside, uh, make them go outside, and it might seem really simple, but I know in me, having the kids go outside and see that people weren't dropping dead on the streets. Having just go outside. There are people out there, and we can be safe, and we can follow all the guidelines and do what we need to do. But we're still going to go sledding. We're still going to we're still going to go out to events and do it as safely as everybody says we need to be doing. Um, but you don't have to fall into the confusion of, oh, can I go outside, or can I go outside? What's going to happen if I go outside? What if I'm sledding and there are other people out there sledding? Or what if I see my friends? Am I allowed to talk to them? I mean, we actually really encountered that with neighbors coming to the door, and thankfully we have pretty good relationships with our neighbors. And we're back. I'm sorry, that's probably my internet. But thankfully, we have really good relationships with our neighbors, such that we could just say, hey, we don't know what we're doing either. What do you guys think? Should we let the kids play? Are your kids sick? I don't know. I saw somebody coughing the other day. Well, of course they're coughing. They cough every winter. But what do we do? And so we kind of just took it as we went. And eventually, the kids were, all summer we have a big trampoline in our yard that the whole neighborhood gravitates to, so we actually had like groups of kids that could come and jump on the trampoline at certain times with their families, and we just had to think through it a little bit. But that, even those little things taught our kids confidence that you can actually figure this out, you can get through it, and like Katrina was saying, you're probably not going to get it all right, but that's okay. We're all going to learn together as we grow. And uh, the opposite of confusion isn't knowing everything. The opposite of confusion is just having confidence to learn and try and and see what we can do together. And one thing that I think is really important about adversity is walking through it with other people. And adversity, whether it's conflict with people or conflict with politics, it can either be divisive or it can be collaborative. And one thing I'd like to propose is that what we're talking about tonight isn't just teaching our kids how to not fail or teaching them how to not get super sick and or how to avoid these terrible outcomes that the ACEs study would propose. But we're actually teaching them that when adversity comes, we have the opportunity to be innovative. We have the opportunity to be collaborative with the world around us. So as we, like Alexandria was saying, as we teach them to use their brains and expand their brains in different directions in the midst of adversity, right in the middle of it, when they have that crucial point where they could start to shrink or they could grow, we teach them how to collaborate with the world around them, not to hide from the world around them in fear or judgment. We isolate ourselves when we judge, right? So how to be curious, how to be collaborative, how to be loving, how to be confident when they come across adversity. And those are the things during the developmental phases of their life. All those little stages that we looked at, that Eric Erickson laid out for us, that have to do with all the different elements of their adult life when they leave our home. They're going to learn to navigate adversity in ways that help them grow. And that's going to impact their relationships. It's going to impact their jobs. It's going to impact their education. It's going to impact how they participate in the world. And I think that's pretty cool. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint again. And like I said, feel free to interrupt me. I will talk and talk and talk, but I don't mind being interrupted. Okay. Holy cow, it's 7 o'clock. Well, good thing I'm almost done. So we just walked through these. So what we talked about tonight was we talked about a little bit about the brain. We talked a little bit about the kind of the state of the way things are and why it's helpful to understand that brain process. We talked about how adversity can affect the brains of children while they're developing and how it can actually stunt the growth of that corpus callosum if very young children experience severe trauma. And then on the bright side, we talked about how we can actually change those statistics, whether our children experience ACEs or not. And especially now when they are experiencing, whether they want to or not, they're experiencing the weight of politics and social unrest and the pandemic, and they're having the opportunities to learn confusion or confidence. They're having the opportunities to learn judgment or curiosity. They're having the opportunities to learn, do I fear this or do I walk forward with a sense of love for others and appreciation for, even though I don't like anything they're doing right now, can I be curious about what I could benefit from that person being in my life? And I heard somebody who was asking a question about this person at work. They're really driving me crazy. I don't know what to do with them. And they were walked through this thought process about how to be so appreciative of this person and all the things they would not experience if this person were in their life. And I found myself going, how did they just do that? I wasn't even going there, and I teach this stuff. That was amazing. Like, and what you end up doing is you end up calling those things forward in your life. When you go through with curiosity and confidence and love, you end up realizing that those things are all waiting out there for you to identify and take advantage of. And the people around you will benefit from that as well. And it might sound Pollyannish, but I've experienced it myself. And I've taught this for long enough that I've watched other people experience it in their lives too. So now I'll breathe. If anybody has any questions or any thoughts at all. I know it's dinner time. Well, I sure appreciate everybody being on tonight, and I appreciate anybody who's watching this later. I intend to keep doing these types of workshops, and I have a lot more content available that I can share with people. My website is doing an overhaul right now, but that's my website, peacemakingpartners.com. And if you shoot me an email, I will send you the ACEs study, the Kaiser Permanente study, so you can have that. And I'll also send you something that's called ACEs. I think it's called ACEs Part 2. And it's a really cool, like cartoonish kind of overview of the ACEs study and the takeaways from it. It's really helpful. So if you shoot me an email, jp@peacemakingpartners.com, I'll send those PDFs to you, and then I'll keep you updated. When my website gets up, I've got a lot of material that people have benefited from over the years, and I'll let you know when that's ready too.
And I was begging JP for some books that he would recommend for us to read to our kids. So if you want to share those with me, JP, we would love to know some ways that we can, if we've got kids in our life who have fear or judgment or confusion, how to kind of move them back towards the other side. So if you've got any book suggestions, you can send those to me, and I will pass those along to all of you guys too. But I just want to say thank you, because this is really, it's not dismal at all. It's actually really inspiring. It's also really empowering, and it helps me know how to move my kids one way or the other, which feels really encouraging. So thank you so much for taking time to teach us all.
My pleasure. And I appreciate that feedback. I know I've been in a lot of ACEs seminars, and I always left feeling like, ugh. And I thought there's got to be a different way that we can communicate this. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I hope to see you again.